before. And I'm going to let everybody in. Hello, 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 and welcome to our session. I'm going to give it just a few seconds to let everybody join. Thank you so much for your patience. We're just a few minutes behind, but technology is going to do what technology does. And we are going to pray that the technology gods are going to be with us for this session. Hello, hello, hello again. Welcome. This is our session, fourth session for today. Welcome to the third annual People of Color Living with Diabetes Summit. My name is Quisha Memba, president and co-founder of DID. I am going to introduce our next speaker, and we're going to go ahead and get started with our presentation. This is Ms. Constance Brown Riggs, and today she is going to be speaking about advancing health equity with culturally relevant nutrition. You can find her biography inside of the VFairs platform. Just click on her name and it will pop up for you. Please put any comments or questions in the chat. And without further ado, Ms. Riggs, you can go ahead and begin the presentation.
Thank you. Okay, as you can see, it's advancing health equity with culturally relevant nutrition. Next slide. Now this is, you can read about me. One thing I just want to point out is my mantra, which is to shorten the cultural distance between the person with diabetes and their healthcare provider. So everything that I do is consistent with that mantra, including this presentation. Next slide. So I have a few disclosures. I have consulted with Old Ways, particularly in development of the African Heritage Pyramid. We'll be talking about that. I'm also a spokesperson for the American Dairy Association Northeast, and there are no conflicts in terms of this presentation. Next slide. So these are my objectives for today. At the end of this presentation, you should be able to describe the prevalence of diet-related chronic diseases in African Americans and Latin Americans, and also identify the barriers to achieving better health and nutrition outcomes in people with diabetes. Also, as you leave, you should be able to classify the healthful foods found in the African heritage diet as well as the Latin heritage diet. And then also to be able to look at those diets, those heritage diets, and identify how they actually mirror the recommendations that you'll find in the American Diabetes Association nutrition guidelines for people with diabetes. And then for our healthcare providers, as you leave this presentation, I hope that you will be motivated to reframe your nutrition education programming in a way that is relevant, that is culturally relevant to our audience. Next slide. So we're going to first look at why we need a new approach to diet and health, why things aren't really working the way that they should for African Americans and Latin Americans. Next slide. So we know that African Americans are not a monolith, but for some people, it may not be so clear. So I always like to start off with who African Americans are. And the definition is based on what the Office of Minority Health identifies as African Americans. And so it's anyone that has ancestry in the Black racial groups of Africa. Many African Americans have been in the United States for generations. Others may be more recent immigrants coming from Africa, the Caribbean, or the West Indies. And you'll find the majority of African Americans live in the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic states. Next slide. Oops, went a little too far. That's it. Up, one back. Okay, so African Americans are currently the second largest minority at 12.8% of the US population. And by 2060, it's estimated that African Americans will make up about 18.4% of the population. So we know the minority population is growing. And that's why it's so important to identify a new approach to health and nutrition, because what we currently have, when we look at the death rates and other statistics, is just not working. So the death rates for African Americans are higher than whites, and we can see heart disease, stroke, cancer, asthma, influenza, and so on. We suffer a greater disparity there. We have much greater disparities there. Next slide. When we look at diabetes in particular, and again, there is that disproportionate burden. African Americans are twice as likely as whites to die from diabetes, 60% more likely to be diagnosed with diabetes by a physician, and 3.2 times more likely to be diagnosed with end-stage renal disease. And then, of course, with hospitalizations for low limb amputations, African Americans are 2.3 times more likely. Next slide. So we look at Hispanic and Latino Americans. And again, I just want to point out that the definition that I'm using is from the Office of Minority Health. I know now there are many Hispanic Latinos that identify as Latinx, but I'm using the reference as it appears in the Office of Minority Health. So it includes any person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or other Spanish culture or origin, regardless of race. And in 2020, the states with the largest Hispanic population were Arizona, California, Colorado, Florida, a lot in New York and Texas, and a few other states that you can see there. Next slide. Latin, Hispanic, and Latino are now currently the largest minority population. I think that just happened in the last couple of years. And in 2060, it's estimated that they will constitute about 28% of the population. Again, demonstrating the need for cultural competence and to look at different approaches in order to see better outcomes in these populations. Leading cause of death in Latinos, got to go back, thank you, is cancer, heart disease, unintentional injury, stroke, as well as cerebral vascular disease and diabetes and Alzheimer's. And in 2020, the leading cause of death was from COVID-19. And Hispanics also have higher rates of obesity than the non-Hispanic population, non-Hispanic whites. Next slide. And when we come to diabetes, they too have that disproportionate burden. They are 1.3 times more likely than non-Hispanic whites to die from diabetes, 70% more likely than non-Hispanic white adults to be diagnosed with diabetes, and they are twice as likely to be hospitalized for treatment of end-stage renal disease related to diabetes as compared to non-Hispanic whites. Next slide. Okay, so we know we have this disproportionate burden of chronic diseases, including, of course, diabetes. And we know also that there are many factors that contribute to those disparities. But I'm just going to point out a few for you to think about that we see, and it comes up time and time again as researchers are looking to determine what is going on. One of those factors, and you probably heard that mentioned a lot, particularly during COVID, was the Tuskegee experiment. And as a result of that experiment, there's a lot of mistrust. Primarily African Americans have that distrust in the medical community. If you're not familiar with Tuskegee, it was actually an experiment on African Americans. They thought they were being treated for syphilis as the researchers were looking for a cure. And as it turns out, the African Americans were not receiving treatment. They were actually given basically placebo. And the researchers at that point wanted to see what happens if you don't treat syphilis. And when that came out, of course, a lot of African Americans died. Today, you still have naturally family members that remember what happened to their loved ones as a result of that experiment. So you have that lingering mistrust in terms of the African community. There may also be language and culture that causes that mistrust. If you're a new immigrant coming into the United States, you don't speak the language, it's very difficult for you to trust the medical community. And it may also be cultural that causes that mistrust. Also, low priority is another barrier. And again, if you're just new to the United States, you're thinking about housing and getting a job and just making it from day to day. You're not thinking necessarily about the future. And then there's other things that would cause you to be more susceptible. Low income. We know that low income individuals generally aren't able to get sufficient amounts of food. They may be making the wrong choices in terms of food. They may be living in food deserts. And in addition to food deserts, now we know food deserts is when there's not supermarkets close to get fresh fruits, vegetables, and that, a lot of perishable foods. It's just not available. Farmers markets aren't readily available in a food desert. But also we have to look at, and I don't have it listed here, but food swamps. And when I talk about food swamps, this is where you may find McDonald's on every corner. So these individuals are going to be, more apt to go to McDonald's for the dollar meal as opposed to eating fresh fruits, vegetables, and so on. So both can cause problems. And then, of course, the lack of culinary skills. And we see the younger generation just isn't cooking as much as the older generation. They may not be able to identify one vegetable, one fruit from another. So that also causes more problems in terms of health and nutrition. And then last, we have spirituality. And in terms of spirituality, both for Hispanics as well as for African Americans, there is that aspect of fatalism, or patismo, I think it's pronounced in Spanish. And here it's basically thinking, everything is in God's hands and that there's nothing they can do about it, and they just accept it. One of my famous sayings, the African Americans often will say, well, I've got diabetes, but I'm gonna, I'm not claiming it. And my refrain to that is, you don't have to claim it, but you do have to acknowledge it. You can pray about it, but you still have to take steps in order to take care of yourself. So those are some of the barriers that we see to achieving better health and nutrition in these communities. Next slide. Now, we know also another barrier is our American diet. Also known as SAD, the standard American diet. And when we look at the American diet, this is from what we eat in America, we can see that no one is really meeting the dietary guidelines. And that's because of the type of diet that we're eating that is low in fruits, low in vegetables, and low in dairy as well. Next slide. And as a result, we're missing on vital nutrients. So the dietary guidelines identify for us, as a result of our poor diet, nutrients of concern. And that is vitamin D, calcium, iron, potassium, and fiber. All nutrients that we need in terms of hypertension and diabetes and cholesterol and so on. So these nutrients, as a result of our standard American diet, are underconsumed. And then on the other hand, next slide, we overconsume sodium, saturated fat, and added sugars. So those are barriers. Just our standard American diet is a barrier to our health and nutrition. Next slide. So as a result, we know that we need to look elsewhere. We can't continue to follow the standard American diet and do what we've been doing if we want to see change. So let's look at some of the evidence for traditional diets. Will they help? Are they going to give us better outcomes than a standard American diet? What we know, what the research shows, is that as individuals shift from their traditional way of eating to industrialized meal patterns, or as they go from their traditional way of eating to the American diet, this is when we begin to see problems in terms of disease states. So if you look at some of the research, metabolic syndrome and obesity increases in Botswana. And again, that's as they go from their traditional diet, they begin to eat more the westernized way, and they end up with obesity, metabolic syndrome. We see new rates of hypertension in West Africa, urbanization linked to poor diet quality and greater risk of chronic disease, as well as, again, just as an example, Mexican loss of traditional Mexican diet also linked to poor nutrition. And these are just some of the research studies that show there definitely is that link between leaving heritage diets, traditional diets, adapting more of a standard American diet is critical in terms of health and nutrition. Next slide. Now, this is just another example, more recent example to highlight. In this particular study, they took 20 middle-aged African Americans and they actually assigned them a traditional African diet. So they gave them a diet that was high in fiber, low in fat, fresh fruits, vegetables, lean meat included in that. And they took the rural South Africans and they gave them the American diet, which is low in fiber, high in fat. I'm gonna go back one. Is it moving by itself? Okay, there was another one that I did that I had that timing going on that. Okay, so as a result of that, giving the African Americans the traditional diet, giving the South Africans the American diet, the end result is that after 2 weeks, the African Americans who were following that traditional diet were actually able to lower inflammation of the colon and also increase the diversity of their healthy gut bacteria. So we can see from this study that it is positive when they're following that traditional diet. They go away from that traditional diet, and this is when we see more problems. Next slide. Here, yeah, the results in 2 weeks. It's amazing. Someone commented in the chat. Yeah, and this slide looks at traditional Mexican diet. And again, we know the traditional Mexican diet is high in fiber, lots of fruits, vegetables. In this particular diet, they also had, what is this? As opposed to the Mexican diet, it's high in corn tortillas, beans. So again, high in fiber, fruits, vegetables, low-fat milk, full-fat Mexican cheese, and low in refined grains and added sugars. And what they found is individuals that were following the traditional Mexican diet were actually able to have a 23% and 15% lower serum CRP, hsCRP, which is a marker for inflammation and insulin concentration. So both factors went down as a result of following the traditional Mexican diet. And respectively, in the overweight and obese women, a low Mexican diet, sorry about that, low Mexican diet score was also linked with higher insulin resistance. So again, these are just a few examples, but they highlight the benefit of following the traditional diet as opposed to standard American diet. Next slide. And then we have, further evidence on the value of traditional diets. And that is pointed out by the consensus report of the American Diabetes Association. Now, this is after they did literature literature review of the available literature prior to the publication. And what they found is that there are a variety of eating patterns that are acceptable for the management of diabetes. And these eating patterns, as you can see, they include Mediterranean, vegetarian, low fat, very low fat, DASH hypertension, and even paleo they have as being a possibility. But I just want to highlight the two Mediterranean, the top two, Mediterranean and vegetarian. Because if you think about those diets, or shall I say, continue to think about those diets and what they entail as we go through the next few slides. Okay, next slide. So we have the Mediterranean diet, and for lack of a better word, I'll say in some people's minds, this is the gold standard. So oftentimes, if you're a person living with diabetes, you may have encountered go for nutrition counseling, and they're telling you, oh, well, you should follow a Mediterranean diet, without thinking about, well, what is it that you typically eat, and how does the food that you typically eat mirror, if you will, what they're calling out in the Mediterranean diet as being beneficial. But unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. But we know that the Mediterranean diet, it's been around, it's been tested. It says doctor tested, loads of research that shows the benefit in improvement in cardiovascular health, as well as weight loss, diabetes, stroke, cognitive health, and more. And also many people have followed the Mediterranean meal pattern, if you will, and they find that it's healthy, it's enjoyable, and so on. But if you're not from the Mediterranean, it may not appeal to you. Next slide. So we do know that the African heritage diet is really very much, in terms of food choices and the nutrient content of those foods, very much the same as the Mediterranean diet. And here you can see, if we look at it at the base, just as the Mediterranean diet, at the base, it's really the family and the family connection, sharing meals together. At the next level, there are greens, because traditionally there were a lot of greens in the African diet. And then the next level, you have more of the beans, and we have, what is it? I can't even see what's there, but it's the tubers and more of your starchy foods, if you will, the grains are at that next level. And then you have your herbs, your spices, fish, and so on. So like with all pyramids, if you will, the base is generally what you should be eating or doing more of. And then as it goes up, those are foods that you want to eat less of. So this pyramid was based on foods that were traditionally part of the African diet. And it too has been doctor tested. You look at the research, some of which we just went over. Diet is high in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, seafood, that all correlates to positive health outcomes. And the African heritage diet meets the nutritional guidelines that are linked to improve cardiovascular health and so on. And again, think of your Mediterranean diet that is highly recommended. The African heritage diet definitely mirrors that. It also is in line with the recommendations of the dietary guidelines, as well as the recommendations from the consensus statement from the ADA. Next slide. And here we also have the Latin American heritage diet. And this happens to be in Spanish as well as in English, which really makes it user-friendly. And as the Mediterranean as well as the African heritage diet, it also is high in fiber, fruits, vegetables, the grains associated with positive health outcomes. And it too has been patient tested. Feedback from the public show widespread positive reception of the Latin American heritage diet. So it's important to remember that you do not have to give up your cultural foods in order to maintain health and nutrition. and also that these heritage diets line up with the recommendations from all of your major health authorities, if you will. Again, the bottom is that family, physical activity, shared meals. At the base, you have starches, your fruits and vegetables, and the next level is lean meats, and as we go up, the fats and sweets. So again, mimicking the design is mimicking other pyramids as well. And I'm getting ready to advance the slide. Next slide. Okay, so this shows us what the pyramids have in common. One of the most important things is that the pyramids are inspired by cultural, culinary, and agricultural traditions. They're plant-based, and core lifestyle habits are included. And they're naturally low in sodium and refined carbohydrate. Next slide.
You asked me to watch the chat for you, and there's a comment in the chat. Someone wanted to know about intermittent fasting, 8 to 12 hours. And I'm not sure if this is in the context of these traditional diets, but if the person is still on and they like to comment or add to that, go ahead. But the question is, what about intermittent fasting of 8 to 12 hours?
Okay, the intermittent fasting really is not part of this presentation, but just to make a comment, if that's the period that you're eating, you still want to look at the foods that you're eating within that period. But intermittent fasting is something that has been used and many people find it successful. You have to work with a registered dietitian if you're doing that and you have diabetes, particularly if you're on medication, if you're on insulin or any other medication that can impact your glucose levels.
Thank you, Connie.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so even the Department of Health and Human Services recommends the benefit of cultural competence and how that honors diversity, all right, and what that means. It means understanding the core needs of your target audience and designing services and materials to meet those needs. And that's what the pyramids do, okay? So there is no one size fits all. Next slide. Our consensus report also, and this is primarily for our healthcare providers that may be listening in today, we have to remember individual nutrition needs should be addressed. It's based on that personal and cultural preference. We have to assess the access to healthful foods, also the individual's willingness and ability. You know, we may want a lot of things for the person that we're working with, but if they're not willing or able to follow through, then we have to recognize that, look at the barriers, and help them overcome those barriers. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we're helping them to maintain the pleasure of eating, positive messages, and we only limit food choices when indicated by scientific evidence. And there is no food that absolutely has to be taken out of anyone's diet. We may have to adjust the measurement, we may have to change the preparation a little bit, but certainly there are no foods that absolutely have to be taken out of the diet. And then we want to make sure that we're giving the individual with diabetes practical tools for day-to-day meal planning. Next slide. Right, I just want to take a minute to look at and talk about equity, equality, and equity. For so long, I've done a lot of presentations for healthcare providers, and some of the response that I would get from nutrition professionals is, I treat everyone the same. Well, treating everyone the same is really not helpful. We could think of that as malpractice, if you will. If you look at this slide and you look at the left-hand side, this is when everyone is treated the same. That's equality. And when you do that, you have some individuals, as the gentleman on the far left, that have an advantage. He has the extra advantage. He can see a lot of that baseball game. Then you have the individual that really didn't need any assistance. That's the one in the middle. He's doing just fine. But the poor little guy on the end, on the right side, he can't see anything. you're treating him the same as you treat that individual that really didn't need any help or giving the other guy the advantage. So that's equality, and that's the problem with equality. What we want to do is help people. We want to treat them equitably. And what that means is giving them what they need, when they need it, and how they need it. If they need that extra assistance for the little guy all the way on the right, he's got 2 boxes. Now he can see the game the same as the little guy or girl in the red. And the other gentleman at the far left, he doesn't have this extra advantage. It's all, he's seeing the game just as the others do. So it's equity. That's what we're looking for in terms of nutrition, as well as treating individuals with diabetes, providing equitable service. Next slide. Okay, there's also, this is just a reminder, there's a Diabetes Equity Bill of Rights. You'll find that in the American Diabetes Association on their website. But this just points out some things in food related, since that's my forte. And healthful food that is accessible, affordable, and culturally relevant, that is your right. Robust insurance that will cover visits to see a registered dietitian, a certified diabetes care and education specialist, and also accessible, culturally and linguistically appropriate counseling. Next slide. Okay. Now, the next couple of slides really are just to highlight the foods that are found in the African heritage, as well as the African heritage pyramid. And you'll be able to see that it shows you, if you look at the top in the middle somewhat, it says eat more often, tells you which foods to eat more often, which foods to eat moderately, and those that you really want to have on very rare occasions. But most important in terms of diabetes, what this also does is it's helpful for the individual with diabetes, as well as their healthcare provider that may not be familiar with the foods. What category does it fit in? Is it a fruit? Is it a vegetable? It outlines that for you as well. Next slide. And I've given you some healthy substitutions that can help to reduce the fat. And that's primarily what's being reduced here, the fat. Next slide. And the African American heritage, same thing, designed the same way, that will help you to identify where foods fit in terms of the diet. Also, on both slides, the Latin heritage as well as this one, I just pointed out some foods that may not be familiar to healthcare providers, and this gives them a little definition, if you will, of those foods. But also, if you visit oldwayspt.org, there you will find definitions of many African heritage foods as well as Latin foods. Next slide. Not moving. Okay. So the bottom line is, regardless of what meal plan you're following, what's most important in terms of managing blood glucose is the amount of carbohydrate. So we know that within our eating patterns, we do have to be concerned with the amount of carbohydrate that those food items are providing. Next slide. And this is just a reminder. You want to read labels. You want to look at the labels in terms of total carbohydrate. Other items, sodium and so on, are important as well. But in terms of balancing out carbohydrate, you want to look at the total carbohydrate. And next slide, very important in doing that is to understand the difference between a portion and a serving. That portion is what you put on your plate, how much food you decide to eat. A serving is a unit of measure, okay? So that's what you find. That's the recommendation from the dietary guidelines and so on. That is a serving. And your labels will give you a serving size, not a portion. Next slide. And you have all of this, and I meant to mention that in the beginning because I knew I had a lot, but this is information for you to look at. It will help you in terms of measuring your foods and making sure that you don't go overboard with your portions. Next slide. And of course, we have the plate method. So this is another way of guesstimating approximately how much carbohydrate you're getting and to help balance out that plate. So the left side, half the plate with non-starchy vegetable, that's going to be about 15 grams of carbohydrate. Small portion, quarter of the plate with starch, that will be another 15 grams of carbohydrate. So this represents about 30 grams of carbohydrate on that plate. Anything else you add, of course, would be extra. Next slide. In summary, really important to remember is that adapting a westernized diet increases the susceptibility to health problems. Reclaiming traditional cultural cuisines has both culinary and health appeal. So definitely, you want to embrace, reclaim your cultural traditions, and reducing overall carbohydrate intake is what helps to improve glycemia. Thank you for your attention. Next slide. These are some resources. As I said, I just want to point out Old Ways because they have recipes, they have all of the information on the traditional diets. For health professionals, if you're looking for research, they curate research, traditional diets, and so on. At the bottom, I Am Cultured. This is relatively new, and it's an app, and it actually connects patients, clients to dietitians based on culture. Okay, next slide. And this is Enjoying Foods of the World. This also is very helpful for individuals with diabetes as well as health providers to give them a little insight into those foods, carbohydrate counts on some of the foods from that particular culture. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, now we'll have Q&A. And you have all of my contact information there as well.
Thank you so much. Such a wonderful presentation. I'm going to go back a few slides because Donna asked a great question, and I want us to be able to have this visual as well. She says, where on the plate does the fruit fall? Or where should be placed on the plate?
And there are so many different plates. Some plates have the fruit in that half, but that's not for a person with diabetes per se. So when we look at the diabetes plate, the fruit would actually be on the outside. And that would be, you know, your small measure of fruit would be about 15 grams of carbohydrate. So about 12 grapes, a medium, small to medium apple, half a banana or a small banana. So that would be the other 15. And then of course, if you have a slice of bread, that would be another 15 grams of carbohydrate. But the plate itself is looking at from the carbohydrate as well as balance of nutrients.
Okay, great, thank you. And now I'll go back to this slide. So your contact information is there. I want to thank you personally for me. Thank you for reminding us how important it is to really strive to achieve health equity in diabetes care and management, and how that even transitions or translates or applies rather to nutrition. Because I don't think a lot of times us as clinicians and practitioners, we remember that. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Thank you also for contributing to the African Heritage Diet. So when I was a chief nurse at a health department, my diabetes program, we actually implemented that curriculum as a part of, we had several nutrition curriculums, but it was something that we offered to our diabetes participants in our diabetes program. So thank you so much for that, for your contribution there. Barbara says, thanks for another great talk. I have also read your book, The African American Guide to Living Well with Diabetes, and it is a wealth of information. So thank you so much for that. And I will say also, being married to an immigrant, my husband is Nigerian. He's been stateside for about 6 years. And I remember a few years ago saying, you got to slow down on your rice. Like the amount of rice you're eating is a lot. And he would say, I have been eating like this all of my life. And you had mentioned about the SAD, SAD American, the standard American diet. And I said, yeah, but that was before you were, Americanized. That was before you came over here. And so now you're eating that same amount of rice on top of a more Western diet. And certainly he's been able now to notice some of those things that you've mentioned before, that you mentioned throughout this talk. So thank you also for highlighting that as well. We've got just a couple of minutes left. If anybody has any questions or comments you'd like to pose at this time, the floor is yours.
Excuse me, did you? Okay, I misunderstood what you said. I thought you said we have a few questions. Okay, so we're out of time. We don't have time for questions. I have you, I've got you. All right, again, it was my pleasure to present today, and I hope that everyone will utilize the information that was given, particularly those that are living with diabetes. Speak up, advocate for yourself. Tell them there's nothing that you can't have, you can't eat in terms of diabetes. So ask them, show me how I can fit this into my meal plan successfully. And particularly if it's a dietitian, they should be able to do that for you without difficulty. And for the healthcare providers, please work patient-centered care. We all know that, and help individuals to include the foods that they're accustomed to eating in their meal plan. And we know now the value of traditional diets.
We do know the value. There is a great question that came in, and we do have a little time. I'd like for you to add some comment for that if you could. Marlon says, this is a bigger conversation, but how would you suggest we put portion control into practice?
Measure. Okay, so putting portion, there's a couple of ways. Right. The ideal way, of course, is getting out the measuring spoons and measuring cups and so on. But is that practical every single day if you're eating out? No. That's one of the reasons that I put the plate there. The plate will help you to give you some idea. And so even if you're, not necessarily counting, excuse me, every single gram, you know that this portion of my plate, if I make it a quarter, even if it's a platter, this quarter is starch. And if you eat that platter and you divide it up that way and you monitor your blood glucose and you find out that it's much higher than you wanted, then the next day, the next meal may be that same platter, but put a little bit less. So, there are ways of guesstimating and getting around that. But of course, measuring cups, measuring spoons is always the best. There's also another app, if you're not aware of it, it's called Figwe. And Figwe is excellent because it will show you the portion of food and you could actually adjust it. So if you're having a quarter of a piece of corn, it will give you the nutrient information for that. If you're having the whole corn on the cob, it will give you the nutrient information for that. And it's visual, so you can actually see the food. That's another excellent way. But a lot of it, we end up guesstimating, but you have to have some idea. So on the information that I gave you, it shows you what a single portion is. You want to look at that. A hand, if it's half your hand or a thumb, it gives you those type of measurements that you can use on a daily basis as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing that link to that app as well, Casey. Well, this has been another great session. Wow, we've had such an informative day. Thank you so much, Ms. Connie, for your time and your expertise. We're going to go ahead and transition out of this session. Everybody take a quick break and we'll see you at the top of the hour for our next session. Take care.
Bye-bye.